did it really begin? Can anyone say when something starts? Grains of sand are added to grains of sand, and before you know it, there's a pile of sand in front of you. These are words from Holocaust survivor Hedi Fried in her book The Road to Auschwitz, Fragments of a Life. My name is Bodil Sundén. I work at the Living History Forum, a public agency with a mission to promote democracy, human rights, and the equal value of all people. By learning from history, with focus on the Holocaust and other crimes against humanity, we want to contribute to reflection and learning about how the past and the present are connected. The Living History Forum has the assignment to promote the commemoration of the Holocaust Remembrance Day. And this year, the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, we have invited the historian and author Professor Timothy Snyder for a series of activities, this talk being one of them. Timothy Snyder is a professor of history at Yale University in the United States and a permanent fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna. His work has gained recognition for connecting historical events to contemporary issues, offering insights into the fragility and resilience of democratic societies. Among Snyder's books are On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, Black Earth, The Holocaust as History and Warning, and Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. These books have been widely praised for their ability to illuminate complex historical narratives and their relevance to current political and social debates. In his latest book, On Freedom, published last year, he explores the concept of freedom, what it is, how it's been misunderstood, and why it's our only chance for survival. Through his writing, Timothy Snyder continues to engage readers in conversations about history, freedom, and the challenges of protecting democratic values. The powerful words from Holocaust survivor Hedi Fried illustrates how gradual changes can accumulate over time. In different ways, they both emphasize the relevance of Holocaust history in today's world, urging us to learn from the past to create a better future. Please welcome Professor Timothy Snyder.
Thank you. It's very gratifying to see all of you here today to remember and to consider and to think. As a scholar, the thinking part might be the most important for me, because remembering, important though it is only the beginning of considering, of thinking, of imagining how things could have happened, and therefore how things might happen again. History is a curious sort of endeavor. It's not really valued very much in contemporary life. Those of us who do it are invited less and less often to comment on contemporary affairs. Except, of course, when there's a round anniversary of an uncontroversially very important event. And the concern for us, or at least the concern for me, is that we remember the essential power of instruction from history. The essential power of instruction from history consists in this: something did happen, and therefore it could have happened. This may seem very simple, but I think it goes very deep. Just remembering that something like the Holocaust did happen, that millions of Europeans were involved in one way or another, directly or indirectly, with the murder of millions of other Europeans. To remember that already goes fairly deep. But the could have happened part goes even deeper, because if we remember that because it happened, it could have happened, then we're forced to ask ourselves what could mean. What are the causes? What are the sources? How can we try to prevent? Because in order to get from remembering to preventing, we have to go by way of understanding and interpreting. Remembering is the beginning, but it can't be the ending. And it's in this spirit that I want to share with you a few remarks. I can't help but begin these remarks in the setting of the world or the Europe in which we now are. The Holocaust was commemorated for many round anniversaries, the 10th, the 20th, the 30th, the 40th, the 50th, the 60th, the 70th, without there being a major war taking place in Europe. I think it's quite essential for us to remember and for us to ground ourselves by remembering that a major war is taking place in Europe right now. And indeed that the scale of the war, the scale of Russia's war in Ukraine, is comparable to the scale of the world wars. The casualties now run into the hundreds of thousands easily, probably well over 1 million, and the refugees run well over 10 million. So we're looking at an event which is something like a world war, but which is being fought on the European side just by one country, and that is to say, by the Ukrainians. And I want to dwell on this for 3 reasons. The first is, if it's happening, that means it could have happened, and we have to ask ourselves, what are the things that made this war possible? I also want to dwell on this because I'm in Sweden, and it strikes me that Swedes don't always remember to what extent their history is connected with Ukrainian history. A funny thing happened on the way to the writing of Snorri's Edda, which is that, thank you for acknowledging that you know what I'm talking about. It's very reassuring to be with Scandinavians and have them say, oh yes, of course. But a funny thing happened on the way to the writing of Snorri's Edda, which is that Scandinavia was cut off from Eastern Europe by Christianity, and then not much later it was cut off by from Eastern Europe by the Mongol invasions, which means that the great significance of Eastern Europe to your own cultural history, I think, is often forgotten or minimized. One has to look hard to see it, but if one does, it's there. The city, the state which was known as Kievan Rus was, for all practical purposes, a 4th Scandinavian state. It was largely founded by people from Svea. Its familiar relations, its languages, its stories would be very familiar to people from Scandinavia. And I would say more, the stories that are familiar to you, or the myths that are familiar to you, were to a great extent actually formed by the East European experience of Scandinavians. The way that the gods and the myths turned out had to do with experience with Balts and Finns and Turkic peoples and Slavs. And this is very clear in the stories if you read them that way. I've made this little diversion because it seems to me to be very important that we hold on to the connections that we have if they are real. And it seems to me that it ought to be remembered that in this country, when we think about Ukraine, we're not just thinking about a country which is nearby or perhaps strategically significant, but also about a country whose history has very many commonalities with the history of Sweden and Denmark and Norway and Iceland. The third reason that I'm going to dwell on this war is that the fact that this war was possible helps us to see how the Holocaust was possible. Not that these events are identical, but that there are some uncanny overlaps between our own moment and between the moment of the 1930s and 1940s. And our difficulty in seeing how the war in Ukraine was possible can also help us to see what we might be overlooking when we try to think about how the Holocaust was possible. Now, how can we do this? The way that we can do this is by asking about some of the deep causes of the Holocaust itself, and then noting how they're connected to events that are going on now. The elemental connection is that Ukraine was Hitler's major war aim. The Second World War in Europe was fundamentally about control of Ukraine and its agricultural resources. Hitler's great fantasy was that control of the black earth of Ukraine, the Schwarze Erde, the Kornkammer, that control of Ukrainian agricultural resources would transform Germany into a world empire. Ukraine was the essence of his war planning. And Ukraine also is deeply connected to the Holocaust because Ukraine had been, for hundreds of years, a world homeland of the Jews, along with Belarus and Western Russia and Poland. And it was the fact that Hitler sought to conquer Ukraine precisely that brought the German army eastwards over the territories where most of the Jews of Europe lived at the time. In all of these ways, the Ukraine and others, Ukraine is essentially connected to the Holocaust. But if we dig a bit deeper, we can see some of the factors that caused the Holocaust, and then those in turn can help us think about our present preoccupation. Hitler talked about Lebensraum, about habitat, about living space, and he had in mind, above all, Ukraine. The notion of Lebensraum was fit into a larger vision of the world, a vision of the world which involved an endless competition for resources. It was a vision of the world, as we might see it today, that was characterized by ecological panic. If you read the beginning of Hitler's Mein Kampf, which you don't have to because I have, if you read the beginning of Hitler's Mein Kampf, you see that this is his view of the world, of the universe, that there are shortages of resources, there are too many people on the earth, and therefore the natural thing that has to happen is a competition of races for land and therefore for food. Hitler says science cannot solve this problem, technology cannot solve this problem, ecological panic is normal. And Hitler also says, and this is very important, the thing which is holding us back from our fight for resources are the Jews. It's the Jews who teach us about the law. It's the Jews who teach us about constitutions, about fairness, about solidarity, about working class consciousness, about working class solidarity. It's the Jews who teach us about the existence of states. It's the Jews who teach us about Christianity. Every idea for Hitler that involved humans recognizing other humans, as opposed to races hating other races, every idea of human solidarity or human reciprocity, said Hitler, is Jewish. That is the nature of Hitlerian anti-Semitism. And so the drive for Lebensraum is integrally connected to the version of anti-Semitism, because the Jews have to be destroyed so that the racial struggle can begin. And of course it works the other way too. When the racial struggle begins, when Hitler invades Eastern Europe, then the murder of the Jews can also begin. So, and this is the second point, we now see, and I think it's hard to see, we now see the deep black character of Hitlerian anti-Semitism, which contains a kind of thoroughgoing nihilism. It's a denial of all good things. Hitler's claim is that all of the things that we might recognize as good, from various political perspectives, incidentally, it could be constitutions, it could be labor unions, all of these things, says Hitler, are the work of the Jews. Christianity, communism, capitalism, all of these things which involve human relationships are the work of the Jews. And what is left, thinks Hitler, when the Jews are destroyed, is an essentially animal human nature. What's left is that we belong to races, just as animals belong to species, and then we will compete. Then we will fight, then we will kill each other, then we will starve each other as God meant for us to do. So beneath Hitler's anti-Semitism is ultimately a kind of nihilism. The third cause of the Holocaust, which I think is worth remembering today, is the destruction of states. So when we think about the history of the Holocaust, and when we consider how the history of the Holocaust is usually taught, it has to do with the rise of Hitler inside one state, inside Germany. And that, of course, is very important. It's very important that the rule of law in Germany was perverted such that some people became second-class citizens. It's very important that Hitler was able to govern from 1933 onward by way of a state of exception, a kind of permanent state of emergency, which lasted until 1945. It's very important that Hitler ruled not just through state institutions, but through parallel non-state institutions, the Nazi Party and the SS, which was not a state institution. It was a party paramilitary. It was an organization beside the state, which was allowed to use violence. That's very important. It's very important that after 1934, Hitler was defined as the Führer, as the leader, rather than as prime minister or president, that he set himself above the state and beside the state. All of these things are very important. The transformation of Germany is very important. But the Holocaust only begins, in the sense of large-scale deportations and large-scale murders, when Germany is able to destroy other states. Austria, Czechoslovakia, and then especially Poland, and the attempt to destroy the Soviet Union. And this is how it all comes together. The attempt to destroy the state of the Soviet Union is connected to the anti-Semitic belief that the Soviet Union is run by Jews and therefore will be easy to defeat, which is in turn connected to the idea that the Soviet Union is full of valuable agricultural goods, especially in Ukraine, which should belong to Germany. So in practice, though, the Holocaust advances insofar as Germany is able to destroy states. And from your North European perspective, or from a West European perspective, this ought to be clear. The thing which is different, for example, between Denmark and Estonia is not that the Danes were nicer people than the Estonians. It's not that there was less anti-Semitism in Denmark than there was in Estonia. That is not the difference. The difference is that the Estonian state was twice destroyed, first by the Soviets and then the Germans invade afterwards, which creates a very different political situation than the one that prevailed in Denmark. And so even as we celebrate the rescue of the 5,000 or 6,000 Danish Jews in 1943 by Sweden, we have to remember that things like that are only possible because there was a Danish state and because there was a Swedish state. Had Scandinavia been in an East European position, things like that would have been unthinkable, regardless of how much goodwill there might have been. I choose that anecdote just to make the general point that there is a politics to all of this which goes beyond the transformation of Germany. It has to do with what Germany does to states which it seeks to invade. The way that Germany treats France, for example, is very different than the way that Germany treats Poland. The largest number of victims of the Holocaust inside occupied France are Polish Jews, not French Jews. And that's for the very specific reason that Polish Jews in France had no state protection because the Polish state had been destroyed from the point of view of Germany, and they had no citizenship from the point of view of Germany. French Jews had citizenship, which meant in order for them to be deported, and of course many were, but in order for them to be deported, they first had to be depatriated. A whole process had to be gone through. So if you just think of that, if you think of this difference between Estonia and Denmark, where in Estonia almost all of the Jews are killed, and where in Denmark most of them survive, or if you think of the difference between French Jews in France and Polish Jews in France, then you have your mind on this very important factor of politics. To what extent does a state in fact exist? Where the Germans destroyed states, where Germans destroyed the civil order, where Germans undid the civil code, where nobody was a citizen, the Holocaust was carried out with much greater thoroughness than elsewhere. So I bring these factors to mind in reverse order now: the destruction of states, the global anti-Semitism, the ecological panic, because these are the kinds of things, in my view, that not only help us to understand the Holocaust itself, but also help us to think forward to the future. Because as the introduction made clear, and as I think we all ought to remember, commemorating the Holocaust always has three dimensions. There's the dimension of respect for those who survived and for those who did not. There's a dimension of dignifying oneself and one's society by taking a serious reconsideration of what one did in the past. But there's also the dimension of thinking about how this knowledge would affect how we prepare for the future. And that, it seems to me, is a very important dimension. So, in that dimension, we can only really address if we talk about the causes. So let's think for a moment about the present war and about the condition we are in looking forward. If we believe that, or if you'll accept with me, if just for these purposes, that the destruction of states is a very important element in the history of the Holocaust, it allows you to evaluate current events perhaps a bit differently. It would make one concerned, for example, about people who wish to weaken European states or the European Union. It would make one concerned about people who wish to weaken the federal government of the United States. It certainly, I think, brings into clear focus Vladimir Putin's avowed goal of destroying the Ukrainian state, which may seem like an obscure detail, but I think in light of what we know about mass killing, it's something very important. And by the way, I say mass killing advisedly. There is a history of genocide and ethnic cleansing which includes the Holocaust and goes beyond it. And this point that I'm making about state destruction is a general point. Mass killing generally takes place in settings where borders have been blurred, states have been weakened, or states have been destroyed. Just having an authoritarian regime is not enough. You also have to have this blurring or this destruction of the state. That's a general finding, which is true in the Holocaust, but true also in other cases that we know about. The second point that I mentioned, the global anti-Semitism or the nihilism, we have much to be concerned about with anti-Semitism itself right now. These things are impossible to measure with any kind of scientific precision, but I think few people would disagree if I say that public anti-Semitism on the part of major public figures is a problem today in a way that was not a problem 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And of course, we also have the issue that we have social media, before which many people spend more time than they do with their fellow human beings, in which anti-Semitism is not only present, but I would argue is algorithmically favored by systems which are designed, or which tend to make us think more conspiratorially and which tend to turn us one against the other. We're also, when it comes to this war in Ukraine in particular, facing a very radical attempt to trivialize or, I think, in a way, endorse the Holocaust, which is Putin referring to the government of Ukraine as Nazis. It's not just this is not true, it's the kind of lie which is meant to destroy the truth. The people to whom he is referring are, of course, Jews. And so his claim that it's the Jews who are the real Nazis, and they're the Nazis because they're the Jews, is meant to undo the process of commemorating the Holocaust. It's meant to destroy the landmarks. It's meant to make it impossible to understand what's going on. And it connects back to the state destruction, because when Putin says Ukraine has no right to exist, its government is illegitimate, the thing that he's not saying out loud, but which Russians understand him to mean, is it's not a legitimate government because there are Jews in it, and therefore it can't be a Ukrainian government. That's not something which is possible. And when we consider 2025, this third factor, this ecological panic, is also very much present. We are in a world where we're choosing between using more or using less hydrocarbons. We're in a world where there are people who profit from hydrocarbons and who therefore are willing to risk resource competition and resource war. We're in a world where the ecological panic of the 1920s and 1930s could return. And of course, I'm not saying that Hitler's view in the 1920s and 1930s was correct. On the contrary, it's horrifying. But what I'm saying is that ideas like his about resource competition and resource war are going to be more plausible if we choose a world in which resources are in fact scarcer, in which floods are more likely, in which fires are more likely, and so on and so forth. And this is, of course, literalized in my country and other places right now as we struggle simultaneously with fires and with floods. So, and then, of course, we also in this world have new kinds of problems with the rule of law, which perhaps were unfamiliar a century ago or 80 years ago. The problem of the extreme concentration of wealth, which allows individuals to exercise something like state power, and also allows them sometimes to spread pro-fascist or anti-Semitic ideas. And we have the problem, which I've already mentioned, of digital politics, in which the way we interact with one another is highly mediated by way of the screen and by way of algorithms, which tend to move the mind in the direction of fascism. So, to sum up, what I've tried to do is make a general point, a specific point. The general point is that history goes on, even if we only listen to historians once every 10 years. History proceeds, and history is about not just recognition and respect, but also about causality, which means that if we take memory seriously, we're remembering not only people, but we're remembering structures and causes, which means that if we're taking the idea of learning lessons seriously, we must not only learn the lesson about our own behavior, which is very much worth learning, we have to recognize that our own behavior isn't just about decency to our fellow human beings. It's not only about not behaving the way everyone around you is behaving, which is the crucial lesson. It's also about recognizing that one has to think about the causes. And this too is a way of standing out, if you don't mind me saying so. You stand out if you are kinder and more respectful and more decent and you don't follow along with the crowd. But you also stand out if you say the Holocaust is a source of historical factors as well as historical facts, which can help us think our way into a better 21st century. That's the broad point. The narrower point is that this war, which is going on now in a neighboring country, whether you're Sweden or whether you're someone else, is a chance to think about some of these causes. Because the war is taking place in Ukraine, it's a chance for us to think more geographically and more specifically about the Holocaust, which in turn allows us, I think, to be more productive in our considerations about the future. So this is where we are. To remember is to reconnect, but to remember is also to reconsider, where the reconsideration has to involve thinking about what caused the Holocaust and what we could do, not just to prevent those causes from repeating themselves, but to steer ourselves in a better direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this interesting and engaging talk. Last week I reread your book on tyranny from 2017, and the book, as many of you sure know, outlines 20 lessons from the 20th century and 20 guidelines for resisting the erosion of democracy, such as standing up for truth and being vigilant against the concentration of power. And I found it maybe to be even more powerful to read in the context of today. And I wonder, what would it be like if you were to write that book today? What would be different?
So for those of you who don't know, On Tyranny is a short political pamphlet. It was written in a few days in late 2016 by an American who had just observed the election of Donald Trump, but also by a historian who a year and a half before had completed his history of the Holocaust, which was called Black Earth, and who 6 years before that had completed his history of mass atrocity in Eastern Europe, which was called Bloodlands, and also by a historian who was in the middle of writing a book about the 2010s and about the reemergence of modern tyranny, or the emergence of fascism, if you prefer, or the emergence of techno-fascism or oligarcho-fascism. So that's where On Tyranny emerged from. It's a set of political recommendations, but it emerged from what I was thinking about as a historian. And so I can give an interesting answer and a boring answer. As a historian, of course, I prefer the boring one. But the boring answer is that if I tried to write On Tyranny now, I would be my mind would be in a different place. I would come up, the lessons would probably be different. The examples would have been different. A lot of the examples were drawn from things that were happening right then. But that said, to give the interesting answer, the more interesting answer, the first lesson, which is don't obey in advance, would, I certainly hope, remain the first lesson, because that's one place where, and I don't like to say this because it's embarrassing, but that's one place where I was certainly right. The lesson don't obey in advance, which is taken right from the 1930s. It's taken from for us Island Gehorsam, right, which a German language concept of the rushing ahead to be obedient, right? So the idea that there shouldn't be anticipatory obedience, that we shouldn't obey in advance. It was very important that was the first lesson, because you have to follow that one in order to follow any of the other ones. If you do obey in advance, the other 19 lessons are not going to be of any value to you. And then I've noticed, you're connecting us now to the present, I noticed that in 2024 and again in 2025, in the United States, it's that lesson, the first one, don't obey in advance, that people are citing the most often and are finding the most useful.
Mm. And as you brought up in your talk, there's a clear trend away from democracy and towards an increasing authoritarian rule in many countries in the world right now. Can you elaborate a bit more on how history can help us to understand this development of today?
Yeah, I can. I think so. Point number one, which might not seem optimistic, but which I think is helpful, is that democracy is always exceptional. Historically speaking, it's always exceptional. It's not just that fewer and fewer people now live under democracy. It's that if you look back over centuries and millennia, it's a pretty unusual human condition. And our historical examples of it, whether that be the United States in the 18th century, or Poland, Lithuania in the 17th century, or the ancient Greeks, our historical examples tend to include members of an elite class who have some way of voting, but not democracy in the popular sense that we think about it today. So it's rare, and therefore it's hard. And that might not seem like good news, but I think it's very important to understand the situation, because here's the second point. A big part of our mistake I believe in the last 35 years or so, was to treat democracy as though it were outside of history, as though it were something which was brought by larger processes. So, for example, we are going to be democratic because we are Americans and therefore we are wonderful. Or we are going to be democratic because we are Europeans and we learned the lessons of the Second World War and we are also wonderful. Or we are going to be democratic because capitalism. Or we are going to be democratic because welfare state. Any of these accounts, which became quite popular after the revolution of 1989 in Eastern Europe, any of those accounts it's not just they're wrong, they are factually wrong, but they're also incredibly demoralizing and in fact authoritarian. Just stay with me for a moment. If you think that some other larger force is actually bringing democracy, that means that you're no longer thinking about democracy. Because democracy is about the people ruling. It has to be the people pushing to rule. And so any story about how some outside force is bringing democracy is itself anti-democratic and will demoralize people and make democracy much less likely. So because democracy, like freedom, there are of course conditions which make it more likely, but it exists half in the metaphysical world, right? Democracy has to be an aspiration. If it's not an aspiration, it's also not going to be a real thing. And so all those stories that told us we don't have to aspire to it because it's going to come, so to speak, naturally, because we're American or Swedish or because of capitalism or the welfare state or because of the European Union, whatever it might be, all of those stories were actively anti-democratic. And they distracted us from the history of the difficulty of democracy, but they also told us that we were somehow outside of history, right? That there was just one force and it was in our favor. So that's another thing history can teach us. But I'm going to give you the thing which maybe you wanted to hear, which is that there are of course cases where democracy returns. There are cases where lessons are learned and where democracy returns. The post-war period in Western Europe is such a period. Europe in the 1930s was not democratic. It was not it varies from country to country, but the general trend in Europe was not towards democracy from about 1925 onward. It was against democracy. It's not that the Second World War ended democracy. Democracy was largely done in Europe before 1939, but the people learned a lesson from the Great Depression and from the war, and there was in fact a new consensus. So it is possible, and it's also possible at a micro level. So it's possible to have cases, in my view, like Poland, where you see the authoritarian trends go quite far, and nevertheless for there to be a reversal. So history, the main thing that history tells us is that more things are possible than we see. And in a talk like this, I'm mostly talking about the bad things that we don't see, but there are also good possibilities that we don't see. I mean, many of the broad conditions for democracy are here. It's more a matter of us, I think, recognizing what those conditions are.
I would also like to ask you about, in this era of disinformation and misinformation, what is your view on the distortion and denial of the Holocaust?
Well, I mean, that's tricky because sometimes when people say, I'll start with denial because that's easy. I mean, the denial of the Holocaust is a horrifying feature of present day conversation, and it's very distressing that saying things that are historically incorrect and morally absolutely perverted passes as free speech. And there's something wrong with the discussion about free speech in that it's become a kind of synonym for saying things that you know are not true and which are deeply painful and which are politically destructive. The purpose of freedom of speech, which is how I would talk about it, is to allow people to speak truth to power. It's about the reason why we have freedom of speech traditionally. The argument for freedom of speech is that it's dangerous for the powerless to speak the truth. And it is, of course, dangerous for them. And that's why we have freedom of speech. We don't have freedom of speech so that the people who have $300 billion can spread lies. That's not why we have it. It might be that the laws protect those people, and probably the laws should protect those people. But we have to remember that the deep purpose of laws protecting freedom of speech is to protect the powerless who are trying to speak the truth. And if we remember that, it will help us with this larger discussion, I think, because we've gotten to the point where free speech is often a synonym for the very powerful saying things that they know are not true in order to manipulate the rest of us, to destroy norms, and to assemble even more power. So denial, of course, I mean, that's how I feel about denial. The denial of the Holocaust, because the Holocaust was such a central feature of the 20th century, denying it is not only a horror in itself, it also allows for all kinds of further revisionism. As far as distortion, this is a little trickier because, you know, your distortion could be my version of what actually happened, and people can be quite quick to accuse others of distortion when in fact they are simply undertaking a legitimate effort to understand what happened. If somebody believes that anti-Semitism alone was the cause of the Holocaust, they might say that I'm distorting the Holocaust because I mentioned ecological panic and state destruction. So it is very important to understand and to accept that there's a lot of legitimate room for trying to understand the causes of an event of this scale, and to try to petrify historical interpretation at a certain point is vanity. Right, where there's never going to be a point where the historians can write an 100-page paper and that will be the final explanation of the Holocaust. That's not how history works, and it's not how it should work. But by a distortion which I find very troubling, and we can pursue this if you want, but a distortion I find very troubling is the political habit, which seems to only be growing, of treating the Holocaust as meaning whatever it needs to mean so that I can pummel my political opponent right now. That's a troubling feature of debate in the United States, where anti-Semitism and references to the Holocaust are used, for example, to tell 19-year-olds that they can't protest Gaza. That is, to my mind, an abuse of the Holocaust or a distortion, because whether one agrees or disagrees, the idea that there was a Holocaust or there was anti-Semitism, that means you can't protest today. That's a deliberate distortion, and it's being used by very important American politicians to say there can't be free speech on American campuses, or there can't be protests on American campuses because the Holocaust. And so for me, and that's not the only example. It's used in both directions. It's used in different countries. But to take the Holocaust and use it to say, I now have a weapon to prevent the other person from having the kind of public life that is necessary for the rule of law, that strikes me as a political distortion that we ought to all be wary of.
And in your new book on freedom, you explore the concept of freedom and the difference between positive freedom and negative freedom, the freedom to and the freedom from. Why is it important to make that distinction?
Well, these are very different ideas of the world. So negative freedom is the notion that the problem, all we need to do to liberate ourselves is to remove a barrier, to end the oppression. And this is a tempting idea because it's simple. But the history of the Holocaust itself shows us how wrong it is. We like to speak about the liberation of the concentration camps. It's a very pleasant way to speak of it, because you then imagine that when the British troops arrive, or the American troops arrive, or the Soviet troops arrive, that what has also arrived is freedom. But if you look closely at the survivors of concentration camps, or if you listen to what they say in their survivor accounts, or if you listen to what the doctors and nurses said about the situation that prevailed in those concentration camps, you realize that the word liberation is not really that applicable. And now I'm quoting survivors and I'm quoting doctors and nurses, because of course it matters that this worst of all possible evils has been removed, but people who are starving, who are ill, who are physically and mentally traumatized are going to need much more than just the arrival of soldiers in order to be free. And if that's true in that extreme case, it's also true in all other cases. One notices it in a less drastic way, but still a fairly drastic way, in the war in Ukraine, when I visit towns that have been deoccupied, to use the helpful Ukrainian word, you see the difference between deoccupation and liberation. Deoccupation means the Russians have been removed, the torture chambers no longer function, people are no longer being murdered, and this is very important. But it's not liberation until the streets have been cleared, the buses are running again, the trains are running again. That's the difference between negative and positive freedom. So, of course, there are moments where people have to be freed of some terrible repression, but if we stop our thinking there, we end up forgetting about the person. And that's so I'm convinced that freedom has to be positive, that negative freedom is the beginning of something, but it's only the beginning. And if we stop at that beginning, then we can end up in some fairly dark places. So if we think that freedom is just about the end of repression, we might think it's fine for governments to be weak or to be dysfunctional. But if governments are weak and dysfunctional, that can lead to worse forms of rule and greater forms of oppression. And again, if you remember the analysis of the Holocaust where the destruction of states is important, then you would also find yourself perhaps more concerned about those who argue that the state should be made very weak or the state should be made dysfunctional in the name of liberation.
And you mentioned in your talk your view on the role of modern technology, such as social media, for example. How do you view this role of modern technology, such as artificial intelligence and social media, in relation to freedom, and in how it can both prevent and enable human rights abuses?
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me try to make a couple points before I answer that. The first point I want to make is the historical one, that technologies are often very destructive before we figure out how to channel them or how to regulate them. So we probably all like books, but I'm assuming we like books because you are here. But the printing press was in fact an incredibly disruptive technology because it allowed people to publish every manner of religious tract, and it allowed people to what, as we would say now, plagiarize. It allowed people to publish anonymously, and the printing press was largely responsible for the religious wars in which something like a third of the European population was killed. So the printing press, although now it's a very calm thing, and you have these beautiful buildings around Stockholm with the names of printing presses on them, and that's lovely. But the printing press was very disruptive in its time. But then we came up with ideas like copyright and authorship, and laws grew up around this, and it became less so. The same is true with radio. That the fascists, of course, believed that radio was a tool. They wanted to have the radio in the Germans, the Nazis wanted to have a radio in every household, and then they could blast propaganda in a uniform way across the country. For us, at least I hope, radio is rather a pacifying technology where we have a variety of access of things. I'm just going to fantasize about your country now, so just don't stop me.
Please.
Where we have an access to a variety of things, from classical music to local reporting about agricultural conditions in Uppsala. As I say, don't break my fantasy. I want it to be that way. And so I just give you those examples because they're necessary to understand the internet. So it's, in a way, it's not surprising that the internet has led to the collapse of democracy, which it has, to reductions in living standards in many places, and to civil strife and violence. That's not surprising. It's also not surprising that its advocates are essentially religious zealots who talk about the end of the world and living forever and so on. We had that with the printing press too. right? We had the religious zealots who talked about the end of the world and how they were going to survive it. So it's not so surprising that we are where we are. The question is whether we choose to believe the religious zealots who tell us that everything has changed and this technology cannot be regulated because it's going to take us to Mars or to the afterworld or whatever they're promising at the moment. We have to recognize this is one more historical moment where we have to take this thing in hand because new technologies are very disruptive. The other historical point, the other point I wanted to make before answering your question is that I don't believe that this is actually high technology. I don't believe that. I don't believe that social media is high technology. Social media is actually incredibly primitive. It's just fast. It's a very fast amalgamation of relatively simple data. And I think calling it a high technology is actually propaganda on its behalf. Social media basically uses mid-20th century sociological knowledge about behaviorism and human reactions, the same thing that advertising agencies use. Basic sociological principles about manipulating us. It uses that at a very fast pace, at the speed of light, with access to a lot of data. But I don't think that makes it high technology. I actually think it's incredibly primitive. And I think when we call it high technology, we are kind of doing its propaganda work for it. And so that's the second preparatory remark. I actually think, you know, the construction equipment or a modern combine harvester is higher technology than social media. So no, I'm not actually joking. I mean, I think there's a funny way in which technology should be enabling humans to think better and do more. And if the technology tends to make us less capable and perhaps less intelligent, is it then high technology, or do we just call it high technology because we have been made less intelligent? So a trick may have been performed on us here, is what I am trying to say. So I think we should hesitate before calling certain things high technology. I also don't, you won't be surprised to hear that I don't really believe in artificial intelligence. I think that if it were artificial intelligence, every time you said, write me a country song about 5 robots who fall in love with a ladybug, or whatever you use artificial intelligence for, but let's admit that's probably it, or something like that. When we ask it those questions, if it were intelligent, it would say, is it really worth melting an iceberg for this? But it hasn't said that yet, to my knowledge, and correct me. And so therefore, I think there's a sense in which it's not intelligent. I mean, the climate impact of what we call artificial intelligence is so terrifyingly great that it calls into question its intelligence and our intelligence at the same time, because we and it will cease to function if we use energy at this rate. I seem to be dodging your question, but I'm trying to say things which I think are kind of important to consider all of this. The general effect of social media on disinformation and our understanding of the Holocaust has, in fact, sadly been negative. Because the platforms tend to drive us towards us and them narratives and towards conspiracy, a feeling of powerlessness and hence conspiracy thinking. There are, of course, wonderful initiatives, and I will mention the Fortunoff archive of video Holocaust testimonies at Yale, with which I'm associated, and many others, which have used modern technology to make survivor accounts and other important materials more accessible, and that's very important. But I think we're going to have to think harder about how to use these tools, and think harder about how to work together with governments to make the technology work in a different, structured way.
And you also raised the importance of talking about freedom. And in an interview about your book, you mentioned that in the Northern European countries, we don't talk enough about freedom. And I found that really interesting. Could you say something more about that?
Okay. Well, first of all, it's very kind of you to raise the subject of my book in this context. I like to think that there is a connection between Holocaust history and thinking about freedom, and I alluded to it when I made those remarks about the concentration camps. I think remembering the Holocaust is also a kind of philosophical endeavor. I'm not the first person to think that. Much of the great philosophy of the last 70 years has had something to do with the Holocaust one way or another. Some of the thinkers who informed my book, especially Edith Stein, who was murdered at Auschwitz, were themselves victims of the Holocaust, or Jewish thinkers who were in some way affected by the changes of the 1930s and 1940s. Simone Weil is also an important thinker in this book. And so so now I've forgotten the question.
That I heard you say that in the Northern European countries we don't talk enough about freedom.
So I'm appreciative that you make this connection, because the connection between the history of the Holocaust and thinking about what human liberation means is very real for me. I think my point in the lecture was that we have to use history to think about not just prevention, but better futures. And I think the same thing about philosophy, that and this is a philosophy book, that when we think of the Holocaust, we have to use it. We have to find ways to think more broadly about human liberation, rather than just to define precisely how it is that humans can do these things to each other. And so in the book, I'm trying to do that, and the experience of dehumanization in the Holocaust is actually very important to the way I end up talking about freedom. But to jump to the answer to your question, we talk about freedom a lot in the US, and what we mean by it is almost always negative freedom. So I'm not the problem. The government is the problem, which is a convenient way to talk about freedom. And the result of that way of talking about freedom is that we deny ourselves a lot of the things that we need to be free. So in my view, healthcare, for example, vacations, these things that you might take for granted are very important for being a free person. If you're a Swede and you look back on your life, you can say, well, look, I had vacation. That's good. That's good. And if you're an American, that's not necessarily true. And we don't think of that as a lack of freedom, but it is. Or to take another example, Americans have to stay in their jobs because it's the only way for them to have health insurance. And they don't think of that as a lack of freedom, but of course it is. Of course it is. And so by thinking of freedom only as me against the government, we end up denying ourselves ways that we might be free. I tend to think that in Northern Europe, it's in a way the other way around, that you do a lot of the right things so that you can live lives which are in fact more free lives than many Americans do. Longer lives, for that matter. And not dying is also good. It's a way to be free. But I meant that remark completely seriously, by the way. But you, in my view, should talk more about those things in terms of freedom and not just in terms of solidarity or national unity or opportunity. Those things are all important. But it's concerning that in Northern Europe and also in Western Europe, the notion of freedom is kind of relegated to people who want the state to be small, or maybe to the people who want the state to separate itself from the world. I'm not sure. But I tend to think that these traditional social democratic values are, first of all, about freedom. But I don't think social democratic people put it that way. And I think that's a mistake, because I think that there are few things are more liberating to people than childcare. Childcare is absolutely central to liberation, and not only for women, but for the baby and for everybody involved. But we don't think about those things as being about freedom, and I think we should.
We are unfortunately running out of time, but I would like to end with a question about hope. It's easy to feel discouraged by the current state of the world as we see human rights and democracy being challenged. Can history help us inspire hope?
I mean, first of all, I would say not only history, because even as things, I mean, things are not going, in my view, at least particularly well in my own country, but we are still, the people in this room at least, I think, most of us anyway, in a place where we know other people who are doing good things. And if you know other people who are doing good things, you can always do good things along with those other people. And that, I mean, I try to do the little things that I can, but the thing which inspires me the most is that I just know a lot of people in the United States and around the world who are trying to do good things. And going back to your question about the digital and the human, the digital can distract us from that. The digital can make us feel that everything is doomed. The digital can distract us from people who are doing good things, because the people who are doing good things are largely doing them in real life and not on the internet. The internet's important, of course, but I think it's largely important to enable us to do things in the physical world. And so I think history is essentially hopeful in one way, but I want to stress that there's a lot of hope to be gained just by cooperating with people who are doing good things now, and by affirming people who are doing good things now. Because again, one thing that digital does is that it discourages us. It tells us it doesn't matter, why should we keep trying? When interactions with humans, we need to affirm them, but also we need to be encouraged by their example. But history is hopeful in one basic way, which relates to what I said at the beginning. So at the beginning I said, the fact that the Holocaust happened means that it could have happened. And this is true of the dark things that happen in history, but it's also true of the brighter things that happen in history. The fact that there have been movements to remember the Holocaust means that that could have happened. And the fact that there have been protests on behalf of justice means that those things could have happened. The fact that European countries became democracies really in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s means that it can happen. There are all sorts of things which have happened which might have seemed unthinkable, which would not have been within the range of our imaginations, but they happened anyway. And so I guess the most that history can say is that the range of possibilities is always much bigger than we think, and that includes the dark things, and that includes the dark things, but it also includes brighter things which we don't see. There are brighter things that are possible that we don't see.
Thank you so much, Professor Timothy Snyder.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you all for listening here at ABF and online. Nu direkt efter detta så visas del 3 av filmen Shoah. Så sitt kvar och ha en fortsatt givande eftermiddag. Tack!